The nails go first, four of them in a row screaming loose from wood that hasn't breathed air in 12 years. Somewhere above a hill past a fence nobody bothers to fix anymore, a lantern is burning in a room the whole town swore didn't exist. Because there's a house up there, tall, boarded, the kind of place children dare each other to touch and run from. And underneath its faded roses, someone just found a door. A door with no name on it, hinges oiled by hands that are long gone, a smell of dust and paper and something sweeter underneath something somebody tried very hard to bury. 60 years of secrets are stacked on those shelves. Boxes, hundreds of them, each one holding a child the world decided to forget. And one of those names written in ink gone brown with age is about to answer a question a girl has been asking her whole life. The door is already open. She hasn't stepped through it yet. They called it the house with the iron eye long before anyone knew what was actually inside it. Up on Elm Hill, past where the pavement gave out into cracked concrete, a tall Victorian stood behind a fence that had surrendered years ago. Boarded windows, paint gone the color of old bone, a round turret on one corner, and in its highest window on certain nights, a light that shouldn't have been there since the house had stood empty for 12 years, and everybody in town knew it. Kids dared each other to touch the gate and run. Nobody had touched the door in over a decade. Until a girl with $60 in a dead man's toolbox climbed that hill with a key on a string and let herself in. That part comes later, though. First, there was a folder on a desk and a clock that ran 4 minutes fast, and a young woman who had learned a long time ago that the fastest way to survive a room like that was to keep her hands busy and her face still. Marnie Hale had exactly $60, 2 garbage bags, and a dead man's toolbox when the state decided she was done being its problem. 18 years old. That was the number on the form. That was the whole reason. The caseworker had a folder open on the desk, a folder with Marnie's whole life inside it flattened down to paper. Report cards, placement records, a photograph from when she was 7, gap-toothed in a coat 2 sizes too big. "You're all set," the woman said. Marnie didn't answer. She was looking at the clock on the wall instead. 4 minutes fast. She'd checked it against the bus schedule taped by the door twice, because that was the kind of thing that kept her hands from shaking. "Your birth certificate's in there, your ID, a list of shelters." The woman slid the folder across the desk like a chess move, like she'd already won. "The one on Baxter Street takes women under 25. Call by 4, though. They fill up." "I know the one. You turned 18 on Tuesday, so." The woman shrugged, a shrug that finished a sentence nobody wanted to say out loud. "So this is where we stop looking after you." Marnie looked at her 2 garbage bags slumped against the wall like tired dogs. One had clothes, the other had a sleeping bag, 3 paperbacks, and a canvas tool roll she'd carried through 5 different houses without ever once leaving it behind. "That's it?" the woman asked. "That's it." No tears. She'd used those up years ago, and they'd never once changed a single line on a single form. Crying was a currency. She'd learned that. And it bought nothing. So she signed where the pen pointed, took the folder, walked out into a gray October morning with $60 folded into her sock, and absolutely no idea where she'd sleep once the cold really came down. She was good at exactly one thing. That was the whole reason she still had the tool roll. When she was 11, the state had placed her with a widower named Abel Fenwick, 3 streets back from the rail yard, a man who restored broken furniture in a garage that smelled like linseed oil and sawdust, and something else underneath something like patience, if patience had a smell. He barely spoke to her the first week. Then one Saturday he set a wrecked little side table in front of her, veneer peeling, one leg cracked clean through. Water rings bloomed across the top like a rash that never healed. "Folks were going to burn this," he said. "Left it out on the curb like trash." He tapped the wood once gentle, the way you tap a shoulder. "You know what's wrong with it." "Everything," she'd said. Abel almost smiled. Almost. "Nothing's wrong with it that hands can't fix." He handed her a scraper. For 2 years she did the work. Learn to read grain like other kids read faces. Learn to coax a swollen drawer loose without splitting the wood. Learn that a dead finish could come back to life with steel wool and enough patience to make your fingers ache. Abel gave her his second best plane, then his best one. Then he stopped calling it his. That garage was the first place she ever walked into and felt the room get easier instead of harder. Then one morning he didn't come out for breakfast, and the paramedics set his heart. And a different woman with a different folder moved her across the county before the funeral was even held. Nobody asked if she wanted the table she'd been fixing. She never found out what happened to it. She kept the plane, though, through every placement after that, the steel of it cold and honest in her hand when nothing else made a lick of sense. So she knew how to fix things. She just had nothing left to fix and nowhere to do it. The library was warm, and it didn't charge admission, so that's where she spent her first 3 days reading job listings she had no address to apply from. On the corkboard by the returns desk, between a lost cat flyer and a notice for a quilting circle, somebody had pinned a single sheet from the county. Public auction, tax delinquent properties, courthouse annex, Thursday 10 a.m. A list of parcel numbers ran down the page in tiny print. She wasn't sure why she went. Maybe because the annex was warm too. Maybe because a person who owns nothing likes being in a room where things change, hands on the small chance that one of them might change hands toward her for once. The annex smelled like wet wool and burnt coffee. 20 or so people on folding chairs, mostly men with the bored patience of regulars. A few in good coats, the kind of coats that already had money and were only there to make more of it. The auctioneer worked through the lots in a flat, fast voice. A flooded duplex, a weed lot behind the gas station, a storefront that had failed as 3 different restaurants. Marnie sat in the back and watched hands go up, watched money she would never have moved through the air like weather she couldn't touch. Next, the auctioneer said. Then he paused, and the pause was what made her look up. Parcel 41-9, the house on Elm Hill. Some of you know it. A few people laughed low, a sound the room had clearly made before. 2 stories plus a turret sits on a double lot. Condition poor. Back taxes going on 12 years. Sold as is, where is. County takes no responsibility. Takes no responsibility is right, a man near the front said, and that got a bigger laugh. A woman a few chairs over leaned toward her neighbor. That's the Doyle place. My boys won't walk past it after dark. The auctioneer let it ride a second, then cleared his throat. We'll open at $15. He said it like he expected to take the offer right back. $15 just to start the failure, just to get to the part where nobody bid and he moved on to the next lot. Marnie did the arithmetic before she decided to. $15 left her 45 and change. A double lot. 2 stories of walls and floor and a roof that had kept 12 years of weather off whatever was still inside. She thought about the shelter bed on Baxter Street, calling by 4, giving it up again by 7 the next morning, every single day, until something came along, or nothing did. She thought about Abel. Nothing's wrong with it that hands can't fix. Her arm went up, slow, steady. The same motion she used to lift a plane off wood at the end of a stroke so it wouldn't tear the grain. For a second, nobody saw it. Then the auctioneer did, and his face did a small, complicated thing. I've got $15 from the young lady in the back. He scanned the room out of habit. Do I hear 20? Nobody breathed hard enough to make it 20. One of the men in good coats turned all the way around in his chair to look at her. His expression wasn't pity, it was closer to annoyance. Like she'd reached past him for the last seat on a bus he didn't even want to ride. Honey, the woman with the boys said not unkindly, you don't want that house. 15 going once, the auctioneer said. Somebody near the front laughed and said loud enough to carry, let her have the ghost. She can charge admission. Going twice. Marnie kept her arm right where it was, eyes on the front of the room, the way Abel used to stand when a customer questioned his price. calm, unhurried, certain of the work in his own two hands. The gavel came down. Sold the house on Elm Hill to the young lady in the back for $15. The auctioneer shook his head as he wrote it in the ledger, and the room broke into that low murmuring that follows a person out a door. She paid in ones and a five at the clerk's window. The clerk, a young man with a careful tie and careful eyes, slid a single sheet of paper across to her, then a key on a loop of string, brass dark with age. He held onto the key a half-second longer than he needed to, like letting go of it might be a mistake. "You know about that place," he said. It wasn't a question. "I know it's mine now." She folded the deed into her jacket and walked out before he could decide to warn her about anything at all. Elm Hill climbed the east side of town past houses that got plainer and more tired the higher you went, until the pavement gave out into cracked concrete, and the trees grew up close on both sides, like the street itself had given up trying to look welcoming. At the top where the road ran out against the hillside, the house stood alone on its double lot behind a fence that had surrendered years ago. Two kids on bikes had trailed her the last block, hanging back, daring each other closer. When she turned up the walk, one of them braked hard. "You're not going in there," the boy said. Couldn't have been more than 10. "It's mine," Marnie told him. "I live here now." The two kids looked at each other. "Nobody lives there," the girl said almost gently, like she was correcting an adult who'd gotten a simple fact wrong. "There's a lady. My brother saw her in the window. She's been dead a long time." "That's a cat," Marnie said. Neither of them looked convinced. They stood up on their pedals and pushed off fast down the hill, and one of them yelled something back that the wind took before it reached her. She stopped at the broken gate and looked. And for 1 second, she understood exactly why the town told stories. A tall, narrow Victorian, a round turret on one corner, 3 stories of it reaching into a flat gray sky. The paint had gone the color of old bone. Most of the windows were boarded. The few that weren't stared down at her blank and dark like eyes that had stopped bothering to blink. The porch sagged on one side where a post had rotted clean through. A wild rose, long gone feral, had climbed the whole north wall and pulled half a gutter loose from its moorings. Everybody who looked at this house saw a haunted house. Marnie stood at the gate and made herself see it the way Abel would have. She saw a roof. She saw bones. A movement in an upstairs window made her flinch. She looked up in time to see a pale shape slip back into the dark. Low. Quick. Her heart went hard for a second, until she understood the shape of it. A cat. A big black one. Watching her from behind the glass. The front steps held her weight. Barely. The key fought the lock, then gave all at once the way stubborn things sometimes do right when you've stopped expecting them to. The door swung inward on a long groan into a hall full of gray light and the smell of dust and cold ash, and something faintly sweet underneath, like old paper left too long in a drawer. She stood on the threshold of the first thing she had ever owned, and listened to the house be quiet around her. "Hello," she said, and felt foolish, and said it anyway. Nothing answered, but somewhere deeper and soft on bare boards, she heard the cat moving. She went in. The hall opened into rooms gone to ruin in that patient way empty houses go. Plaster down in sheets. A chandelier furred gray with cobweb. A staircase curving up into shadow with a banister. She could tell just from touching it was good solid oak under all that grime. She moved through slow, cataloging damage and worth in the same breath, the habit so deep in her hands she didn't even notice she was doing it. Floors wide plank sound. Windows old wavy glass, the kind nobody made anymore. Whoever built this place had built it to outlast them. It was in the back hall that she stopped, because the back hall didn't make sense. A row of hooks ran along the wall at waist height, and below them a second row, lower, set at the height of a child. Dozens of hooks, far more than one family would ever need. She stood looking at them, then turned, and saw the door frame into what must have been a dining room scarred top to bottom with pencil marks, little horizontal lines. each one with a date, a name beside it in different hands. The lowest were a few feet off the floor. The highest were over her head. She crouched, read the closest one. A name she couldn't quite make out. A date. Another name. A different year. Some lines drawn over, names faded, dates going back decades. A growth chart. Not for one child. For more children than she could count. The kitchen, when she found it, was the size of a small restaurant's. A range built for cooking in quantity. A long, scarred work table. Shelves built for more plates than any single family would ever own. Marnie stood in the middle of it, two garbage bags still hanging from her hands, and felt the first real prickle of unease she'd felt since the gate. Not because the house was frightening, because it wasn't. It felt under all the ruin like a place that had once been full of people, and she could not work out who they'd been, or where they'd gone, or why a house that had clearly held so many had been left to rot at the top of a hill while the whole town below crossed the street to avoid its shadow. She was still standing there when the cat came to find her. It appeared in the doorway, the black one from the window, lean, one ear ragged, watching her with green eyes that held no fear at all. It looked at her a long moment, the look you'd give a stranger who'd wandered into your own home. "I bought it," Marnie told the cat. "Fair and square, $15. The cat turned, walked back into the hall, stopped, looked over its shoulder at her, waiting. She'd grown up around enough strays to know exactly what that meant. She set down her bags and followed. It led her up the curving stairs, sure-footed where the boards had gone soft, along the corridor on the second floor, past 3 bedroom doors. And then it stopped at the very end of the hall at a stretch of wallpaper faded into a pattern of tired cabbage roses. And it sat down and stared at the wall and would not move. "There's nothing there," Marnie said. The cat did not so much as flick an ear. It stared at that wall like there was a door hiding behind it. And after a moment, Marnie stopped looking at the cat and started looking at the wall too, at how the hallway ran, at the rooms she just passed, at the size of the house from the street. The hall ended too soon. She was sure of it. From the gate, the second floor had run the whole length of the house all the way to the turret. From in here, it stopped a good 15 feet short, at a wall covered in cabbage roses, with a cat sitting in front of it like it had been waiting 12 years for somebody to finally come up and ask the right question. She reached out, pressed her palm flat against the paper. Behind it, faint cool, came the draft of a space the rest of the house didn't even know it had. The cat looked up at her, then back at the wall, patient as a clock. The light through the boarded windows had already gone the color of ash. She had no lamp, no power, a single book of matches in her jacket pocket. And Abel's first rule had always been, you don't take a thing apart in the dark. Whatever was sealed behind those roses had waited longer than she'd been alive. It could wait one more night for her to see what she was doing. So she went back down the stairs, to make herself a place to sleep on the floor of a house she owned. And the cat stayed at the wall a while longer before it came down to find her. The first night she slept in her clothes on the parlor floor, zipped into the sleeping bag, jacket bunched into a pillow, Abel's tool roll under her hand close enough to reach without opening her eyes. The cold came up through the boards. The house talked all night. Small sounds old houses make. A tick in the walls. A long sigh down the chimney. A loose board settling somewhere over her head. Twice she woke sure she'd heard footsteps. Both times it was only the cat walking its rounds. Toward morning it came and lay against her spine. A warm weight. She let it. "You stay, you eat," she told it, which was the only deal she'd ever really known how to offer anybody. The cat didn't argue. By the second day, she'd started calling it ash for the color of the fireplace it liked to sleep in, and because it seemed to belong to the char of things more than to the light. She'd half expected to wake that first morning and talk herself right out of it all. A sensible person would have taken the shelter bed in the warm library and waited for a real apartment to come along. But she'd woken in a house with her own name on the deed, the first roof that had ever been hers to keep or lose. And handing that key back to the county was the one thing she knew with total certainty she would not do. Whatever this house turned out to be, it was hers now. She'd either fix it or go down with it. Morning came up gray and honest through the gaps in the boards, and she walked the house with her hands. That was how Abel had taught her to look at a thing, with fingers not eyes, because eyes lie, and wood never does. The plaster was a loss in most rooms, but plaster is only plaster. The bones were good, beams overhead dry and true. The roof had one bad place over the back bedroom where the sky showed through in a ragged coin of light, and rain had been getting in there for years. But it was one place, and one place could be patched. She stood in the ruined kitchen and made a list in her head and started at the top one bite at a time, because that was the only honest way to face down a job that looked impossible. Stop the water first, then a door that locks, then light, then warmth. Everything after that was finish work, and finish work she could do in her sleep. She had $45 in change, so she went down the hill to spend some of it. The town below had been built for a lot more people than it currently held. Wide brick streets, tall storefronts, half of them dark, the rest just hanging on. She passed a diner with steamed-up windows, and her stomach said something about it, but she kept walking until she found what she needed. A low building on the edge of the old industrial block, its yard full of salvage doors and clawfoot tubs and stacked lumber gone silver in the weather. A hand-painted sign said, "Reclaim hardware salvage odd lots." A bell over the door announced her. Inside it smelled of old iron and cut pine. A woman behind the counter looked up from a ledger, somewhere in her 60s, broad-shouldered, reading glasses shoved up into gray hair, forearms that said she moved her own stock. "Help you find something. I need a hasp and a padlock." Marnie said it fast like a list she'd been rehearsing. "A tarp big enough for a roof patch. Lamp oil if you've got it. Whatever roofing cement comes cheapest." The woman set down her pen. "That's a specific list for somebody I've never seen." A pause. "You working a job?" "My own place, fixing it up." Whereat, Marnie had learned that the truth cost less in the long run than a lie ever did. So she paid it. "The house on Elm Hill, I bought it at the county auction." The shop went quiet in a particular way. The woman looked at her over the top of her glasses for a long moment, then came out from behind the counter. "You bought the Doyle house." A short laugh, half something older underneath it. "Lord, somebody finally did." She put out a square, capable hand. "Rosalind." "I own this pile," Marnie said. "Marnie. Well, Marnie." Rosalind looked her over. The duffel of a life carried on her back. The boots that had walked a long way to get here. She didn't ask any of the questions a worse person would have asked. "Come on, let's get your roof shut." She loaded the cart herself, and Marnie noticed the prices she wrote down were not the prices on the tags. A kerosene lantern she called a loaner. A coil of good rope she called scrap. When Marnie tried to argue, Rosalind waved it off. "You're keeping the rain off the Doyle house," she said. "Far as I'm concerned, that makes you a customer for life. You can owe me." They carried it out to the yard together, and Marnie asked because she had to ask somebody, "What's the story on it?" "Everybody acts like I bought a grave." Rosalind leaned against a stack of old doors, folded her arms. "Depends who you ask." A beat. "Ask the county. It's a tax write-off they couldn't give away fast enough. Ask the kids it's haunted. Dead woman walks the upstairs at night with a lamp." She paused again. "Ask me, I'll tell you the truth, which is that Seraphina Doyle lived in that house near 60 years, never turned a soul away in her life, and this town decided that was the strangest thing it ever heard of." Her jaw tightened. "I call it the only sane thing on the block." "Seraphina Doyle," Marnie repeated. "That's who the key belonged to. That's who built it near enough, took it on young, kept it till she died. 12 years back now. Rosalind's eyes went somewhere else for a second. Folks saw a light in that turret window her last years and decided she was a ghost before she was even gone. Easier than asking after an old woman, I suppose. Easier than going up the hill. What did she do up there all those years? Rosalind was quiet a moment. That, she said, is a longer story than your roof can wait for. Come back once the rain stopped and I'll feed you and tell you some of it. She handed Marnie the lantern. Go on, light's burning. You got somewhere to sleep up there? It wasn't quite a question. It's got walls and a roof now. That's more than I had on Tuesday. Rosalind looked at her a long moment. Serafina would have liked you, she said finally. She had a soft spot for the ones who turned up with nothing and didn't ask for a single thing more than that. Before Marnie left, Rosalind disappeared into the back and came out with a paper sack warm that turned out to hold half a sandwich and an apple. She didn't make a thing of it, just set it in the cart. Eat while you work, you're all elbows. Marnie climbed the hill with more than she'd come down with, and a strange tightness in her throat she didn't have a name for, and didn't try to give one. She patched the roof that afternoon. Cold, ugly work balanced on the steep slope tarp, snapping in the wind, roofing cement, freezing on the trowel before she could spread it fully. But when she came down, the coin of sky over the back bedroom was gone, and the house was for the first time in 12 years dry. She stood in the yard and looked up at her own work, felt that specific clean satisfaction of a thing that had been broken, and now was not. Ash watched from the windowsill. The next morning she went at the front door. It had swollen in its frame across a decade of wet winters and dragged so bad it wouldn't latch, which meant it wouldn't lock, which meant she might as well be sleeping in the yard for all the security it offered. She took it off its hinges, laid it across two sawhorses she'd made from porch rubble, unrolled the canvas tool roll. The block plane fit her hand like it had grown there. She set the iron fine, went to work down the swollen edge, and the shavings came off in long curls that smelled like a 100-year-old door, and the rhythm of it emptied her head of everything but the wood. This was the one place she had always known exactly who she was. A girl with a sharp tool and a thing that needed mending. A while into it, she looked up and found she had an audience. Two kids at the broken gate, the same boy and girl who'd warned her off that first day straddling their bikes watching her work the plane. You really live here, the boy said. I really do. She blew the shavings off the door. You want to come see or you want to keep guessing from the road? They traded a look. The long, careful look kids give something when they're deciding if it's a trap. Then they let their bikes drop in the weeds and edged up the walk, stopping a safe distance from the steps. Is there really a ghost? The girl asked. There's a cat. Marnie held up a long curl of wood shaving. His name's Ash. He's mean to mice and decent to me. She handed it over. Here, smells like 100 years ago. The boy took it like it might bite, then sniffed it, and his whole face changed. Whoa. They stayed 20 minutes peppering her with questions. She answered straight. And when they pedaled off down the hill, they'd forgotten to be afraid of the house at the top of it. It was a small thing, but small things were the only kind she'd ever had to give. She didn't notice the truck until the door of it shut. Parked at her broken gate. Big, clean. The kind of truck that had never hauled anything heavier than golf clubs. The man coming up her walk was the man who'd turned around in his chair at the auction. He wore a good wool coat, boots that had never once seen a job site. He looked up at the house with the expression of a man doing arithmetic in his head. That's a lot of work for one person, he said. Pleasant. He stopped at the bottom of the porch steps. I'm Desmond Kane. You're the young lady who surprised us all Thursday. Marnie, she didn't stop planning. Did I take something of yours? He smiled. The smile was practiced and not entirely unkind. In a manner of speaking, my company's been putting this whole block back together for 3 years. Senior housing, a clinic, some retail. Good for the town. He spread his hands. This lot was the last piece, and I'll be honest, I expected to pick it up cheap and quiet. You beat me to it. No hard feelings. A pause. In fact, I came up here to make your week. I'll buy it from you. Today, $8,000 cash. I'll even cover the cost of moving you anywhere in the county you want to go. He let the number sit there, watching it land. You paid $15 for a condemned fire trap. I'm offering you $8,000 and a fresh start. That's not a negotiation. That's a gift. It was more money than Marnie had ever seen in one place in her whole life. For 1 second, the whole shape of an easier existence opened up right in front of her. A deposit on an apartment, a real bed, heat that came from a thermostat instead of a wood stove she hadn't even bought yet. She let herself look at it, then she set the plane down on the door and looked at him instead. No. Kane blinked. People clearly didn't say that word to him often. I don't think you understand the position you're in, he said. Voice still warm, but underneath it the warmth had gone flat and level. That house has open code violations going back years. There are people at the county who've wanted it condemned since before you were born. As the owner, that liability is yours now, not theirs. I can make all of that disappear with a signature. You came up here to be neighborly, Marnie said, and now you're telling me you can have my house torn down. I'm telling you, he said carefully, that I'm the best offer this house will ever get. From anybody. Ever. He took a card from his coat pocket, set it on the porch rail. Think about it overnight. Don't think about it too long. He walked back down to his clean truck and drove away. Marnie stood there with the plane in her hand and looked at the white rectangle of his card sitting on the rail and did not pick it up. She found the notice taped to her gate the next morning. County of Ashford Falls. Notice of unsafe structure. Hearing scheduled 11 days. The building inspector would recommend whether the structure should be repaired or demolished. She read it twice, then folded it into her jacket next to the deed. Because a person who owns nothing learns fast to keep all her papers together. And she went back inside to the work, because the work was the only answer she'd ever found to anything. But the wall would not leave her alone, and neither would the cat. Ash had a vigil now. Every few hours he climbed to the second floor and sat in front of the cabbage roses at the dead end of the hall and stared. And when Marnie came up, he'd look at her, then back at the wall, then back at her. The meaning of it was plain enough by now. She'd stopped pretending not to understand. On the third afternoon, she gave in. She brought up the lantern, a putty knife, got down on her knees beside the cat, and started to read the wall with her fingers the way Abel taught her to read anything worth reading. The paper was newer than the paper everywhere else in the house. That was the first wrong thing. Everywhere else, the wallpaper had faded and curled and gone soft with age. But this stretch was tight, whole, like it had been hung long after all the rest. Hung over something. She slid the putty knife under a seam and peeled. The paper came away in one long strip, and underneath was not plaster. Underneath were boards, wide pine nailed flat across the wall in a rectangle taller than she was. And around the edges of that rectangle, she could see it now, the casing of a door frame somebody had covered up on purpose, a door boarded shut, papered over, hidden from a house that had clean forgotten it was even there. She sat back on her heels, her heart going hard. Okay, she said to the cat. Her voice came out unsteady. Okay, you were right. She thought about Kane's card sitting on the rail in the rain, about the notice folded into her jacket, about $8,000 she'd already turned down without even sleeping on it. And for one cold moment, she wondered if she was about to find out exactly why this house had been sealed shut, and exactly why it might be worth $8,000 to a man who wanted it torn down before anybody looked too closely. Then she fit the claw of the pry bar into the first board, set her weight against it, and pulled. The first board came loose with a shriek of old nails that echoed all the way down the empty hall. The second came easier. By the time she'd pulled the fourth and could see the shape of a door hiding behind them, the light outside had gone completely. The only light left was the small gold circle of the lantern, and the green coins of the cat's eyes watching beside her patient like he'd known this moment was coming for 12 long years and had simply been waiting for somebody with the right hands to arrive. The door had no lock, just a porcelain knob gone yellow with age. She wrapped her fingers around it. Cold, smooth. It turned. The door swung inward on hinges somebody had oiled before they sealed it, swung without a sound into a darkness that smelled of dust and dry paper, and underneath that very faint something almost like lavender. Marnie lifted the lantern, held it through the doorway, and the light reached in and found the first thing, and she forgot for a moment how to breathe. A bed, a small one, a child's bed with a white iron frame made up neat, a quilt folded square at the foot, like whoever slept there had simply stepped out that morning and meant to come right back before dark. It had not been slept in for a very long time. The quilt was gray with the dust that sifts down even through a sealed door, but the corners were still sharp. Somebody had cared once about the corners. Marnie stepped through the doorway, lifted the lantern higher, and the room came up out of the dark around her. It was the missing end of the house, the part the hallway had never reached. Wide and low under the slope of the roof, the round wall of the turret bulging out at the far end, one tall window there. The window the whole town had seen a light in, and called it a ghost. The glass was painted over from the inside. Black. Careful work, the kind that takes hours, not minutes. Somebody had not wanted to be seen up here. Somebody had sat up here anyway, year after year, in the dark, with a lamp. The walls were shelves, floor to ceiling both sides, and the shelves were full of boxes, small ones, shoebox size and smaller, hundreds of them, each one labeled on the end in the same careful hand she'd half recognized on the brass key tag downstairs. She lifted the lantern to the nearest box, read the label, a first name, a year, another box, another name, another year. The years went back and back and back. The earliest she could find tucked low in a corner said 1954. She set the lantern down on a small writing desk beneath the painted-over window, and on the desk sat a book. Thick, bound in cracked black leather, the kind a store would call a ledger. It was the only thing in the whole room without a layer of dust on it, because the dust on it had been wiped clean by a hand more than once. She sat down slowly in the chair at the desk, the chair where an old woman had sat alone in the dark for years, and she opened the book to the very first page. At the top in ink gone brown with age, it said, "The children of this house," and beneath that, a single line written in a hand that hadn't started shaking yet. Every one of them was somebody's. We just kept them till somebody remembered. Marnie sat very still. The lantern threw a small gold circle of light across the page. Somewhere behind her in the dark, the cat settled down against her boot and did not move. Downstairs, the notice in her jacket pocket had 11 days left on it. Up here in this room, none of that seemed to matter yet, because the first entry was waiting, and so was the next one, and the next. And Marnie Hale, 18 years old, $60 poorer than she'd started a house full of secrets, settling around her like dust after a long-held breath, turned the page and began to read. The book did not let her go easy. Marnie read until the lantern guttered low, and then she trimmed the wick, and then she read more, because that was the only way through a thing like this. Not around it, through it. Page after page, decade after decade, the same hand getting shakier as the years climbed. Came in November, half froze. 14. Said his daddy put him out. Stayed the winter. Sent him to my cousin in Ohio come spring with a coat and $40. Then the next entry. Then the next. Girls who arrived pregnant and scared and left with a plan and a little dignity intact. Boys the county had already given up on twice over. Children dropped at the door in the dead of night with notes pinned to their coats. Notes that all said some version of the same 6 words. Please, just for a while. One entry near the middle of the book had almost nothing under the name. Just one line. She never said a word the whole 8 months. She is safe now. That was the entire entry. Marnie read it twice, then had to set the book down and press the heels of her hands hard against her eyes until the burning behind them stopped. Because this house had not been haunted. This house had been a place that took in the children nobody else would. For 60 years, run by one woman who never once told the town what she was doing, because the town would have found a way to stop her. They always did with women like that. Serafina Doyle had spent her whole life on kids the world had already thrown away. And when she got too old to take in any more, she hadn't bragged about it, hadn't built herself a monument. She had gathered up every trace of every child she ever saved, every keepsake, every photograph, every scrap of a life, and sealed it all into one room, and painted the window black so nobody would come looking, and she had sat with it alone in the dark until she died. And then the house had waited 12 years for somebody to find the door. Marnie brought the ledger down to the kitchen the next morning because she couldn't stand to read it alone in that turret one more night. Not yet, not until she understood what she was even holding. She spread 3 of the oldest boxes across the long, scarred work table, and that's where Ash found her curled into a patch of gray morning light, watching her hands like he expected her to close the boxes back up and pretend none of it had happened. She didn't. She went down the hill instead, because she had to tell somebody, or she was going to come apart at some seam nobody could see. Rosalind took one look at her face across the salvage yard and put down whatever she'd been holding. "You found it," she said, not a question. "Whatever it is, you found it." So Marnie told her. In the back of the shop, over coffee gone lukewarm in a chipped mug. And Rosalind listened with both hands wrapped around her cup, her eyes going wet and angry at the exact same time, which Marnie hadn't known a person's face could even do. 60 years, Rosalind said when she finished. I knew some of it. Everybody my age knew a little. The way you know a thing you've all agreed not to look it straight. She shook her head slow. You'd see a new kid in town staying up at the Doyle place. Then a few months later, they'd be gone. And nobody asked. She stopped. There was a girl in my class one year, just 1 year, and then she wasn't there anymore. Rosalind's voice had gone somewhere far away. I never once thought to wonder where a person goes. Marnie set her cup down. Careful, like it might crack if she moved too fast. Rosalind. Were you one of hers? Rosalind didn't look up. Didn't need to. 1962. I was 9 years old and my mother had already remarried twice, and neither husband wanted a 9-year-old underfoot. Her jaw tightened. Serafina fed me for 11 months, taught me long division at that same kitchen table you're probably eating breakfast off of right now. Never once made me feel like a burden she was carrying. You never told me. You never asked the right question yet. Rosalind finally looked up. Her eyes were dry now, steady. I've spent 50 years in this town letting people call that house a curse, because the alternative was standing up and saying what it actually was. And I was scared. That's the truth of it. I was scared of what people would think of me once they knew where I came from. The word landed between them and just sat there. What changed? Marnie asked. You did, showing up with $15 in a dead man's tool roll. Rosalind reached across the little table, gripped Marnie's wrist. Hard, brief. Somebody finally lit that window again. I wasn't going to keep hiding once somebody had the nerve to do that. Marnie went home with that sitting heavy in her chest. And that night, back up in the turret, she found her own box. Except it wasn't labeled with her name. It couldn't have been. She'd never lived here. She'd never even heard of this town before the auction flyer on the library corkboard. But it was the year that stopped her, because the box was labeled with a name she recognized instantly. A name she'd seen exactly once before on a single line of a single form years ago in a different caseworker's office in a different county entirely. Her mother's name, Delphine. Marnie sat frozen at the little desk with the box unopened in her lap. Her hands had gone still in that particular way. Hands go still right before they start shaking for real, because it couldn't be the same Delphine. Except Except how many Delphines could there possibly be with that exact spelling, born in the exact decade that would make the math work out? She opened the box. Inside a photograph, black and white, curled soft at the edges. A thin girl, maybe 17, standing on the front porch of this exact house, squinting into the sun. And beside the photograph, a folded letter in handwriting Marnie had never seen before in her life, and yet somehow recognized in her bones anyway, the way you recognize your own reflection in a window you didn't know was there. She unfolded it. If anybody ever reads this, I had a baby girl in March. I couldn't keep her. My people wouldn't have it. Serafina found her a good family 2 towns over and told me not to look back, that looking back only makes the leaving hurt twice. I did what she said. I have never once stopped thinking about it. Marnie read it 3 times, and then her whole chest folded in on itself, quiet, the way a house settles when nobody's watching. Because this wasn't just Serafina's story anymore. This was hers. She didn't sleep that night. She sat in the turret with Ash pressed warm against her leg, and she read the ledger entry that matched the box over and over until the words stopped being words and just became a shape she'd memorized. Delphine, 17, came in September, 3 months along, stayed through the winter. Girl born in March, healthy 10 fingers, 10 toes. Placed with a good family 2 counties east. Delphine went home to her people the next week. I never saw her again. I think about her every single year on the baby's birthday. I hope somebody tells that child someday that she was wanted by at least one person in this world, even if it wasn't the one who carried her. Marnie pressed the page flat against her chest, like that could somehow move the words directly into her skip, the reading part entirely. Because her whole life she'd believed exactly one thing about her mother, that she hadn't wanted her. That was the story every caseworker's file had quietly implied without ever once saying it outright. A baby left behind meant a mother who didn't want the weight of one. And now, here was a dead woman's handwriting, 60 years old, saying the opposite. Saying her mother had been 17 and scared and cornered by people who wouldn't have it. Saying somebody had wanted her to know someday that she'd been wanted. Which meant every version of her own story she'd carried since she was old enough to carry anything at all had been wrong. Which was almost too much of a thing to hold at one time. On top of a house, on top of a hearing, in 11 days, on top of everything else, this town kept dropping in her lap like it thought she had room to spare. She didn't. She had exactly this much room. And it was already full. She told Rosalind the next morning because there was nobody else left to tell. And because carrying it alone for 1 more hour felt like it might actually crack something inside her ribs. Rosalind set down the coffee pot very slowly, like her hands needed the extra second. Delphine, she repeated. You knew her. I was 19 by then, already gone from the house myself. But everybody in this town who'd passed through Serafina's kitchen knew everybody else who had one way or another. Rosalind's face had gone somewhere careful. Delphine had people up on the North Ridge, hard people, the kind who'd rather lose a daughter than lose face in front of their church. So she really didn't have a choice. Some people don't get one. That's the whole tragedy of it. Rosalind reached out and squeezed her hand once firm. You want my honest opinion? Always. I think that woman spent every year after loving you from 2 counties away the only way this town would let her. And I think you just found the only proof of it that still exists in this world. Rosalind's voice cracked just slightly on the last word. Don't waste that. Whatever else happens with this house, don't waste that part. She didn't have long to sit with it, because 11 days had already shrunk down to 8, and the house still had a hearing hanging over it like weather that refused to break, and Desmond Kane's white business card was still sitting exactly where she'd left it, on the porch rail. In the rain, curling at the corners now. She almost threw it away twice. She didn't, because something about keeping it felt like keeping score, and she wasn't ready to stop keeping score just yet. The knock came on a Tuesday. Not Kane's knock, she'd already learned his by now 3 sharp raps, confident a man who expected doors to open for him. This was different, softer, almost apologetic. She opened it to a man in his 50s, wearing a suit that had clearly been expensive once years ago and had not aged as gracefully as he had. He held a leather folder against his chest like a shield. Miss Hale, depends who's asking. Nathaniel Pruitt. I represent a family with a legal claim to this property. He said it fast, like ripping off a bandage. The Ashworth family. They held the original deed to this parcel before the county ever took it for back taxes. There's some question as to whether that seizure was properly conducted. Marnie felt the floor tilt slightly under her the specific way it tilts when a person realizes the ground they were finally starting to trust was never quite as solid as they'd hoped. You're telling me somebody else thinks they own my house. I'm telling you there's a dispute. He opened the folder, held out a single page, old official looking, the kind of document designed to make ordinary people feel very small very fast. My clients intend to file before your hearing. If the claim succeeds, the county's sale to you could be voided entirely. Meaning what? In plain words. Meaning you could lose the house, regardless of what happens at the hearing next week. He said it gently, which somehow made it worse. I'm sorry to bring this to your door. I thought you deserved to hear it from a person instead of a stack of paperwork. He left the page with her and left. And Marnie stood in her own doorway holding a piece of paper that suggested none of this. Not the deed, not the $15, not the ledger, not her mother's handwriting. Hiding 2 floors up might actually belong to her at all. She found Rosalind at the shop within the hour and slapped the page down on the counter between them, like evidence in a trial that hadn't started yet. Ashworth, Rosalind read, and went very still. Well, that's a name I haven't heard spoken out loud in this town in about 40 years. You know them. Everybody who's lived here long enough knows them. Old money, older grudges. Rosalind pushed her glasses up into her hair and rubbed at her eyes like she could physically wipe the last hour away. The Ashworths owned half this hillside before the Depression took most families' land clean out from under them. Seraphina's own father bought this parcel for pennies at a tax sale, same as you just did. History does love repeating itself when nobody's paying attention. So there might actually be something to their claim. There might be paperwork to their claim. There's a difference. Rosalind folded her arms. But I'll tell you something else about the Ashworths, and you should sit down for it. Marnie sat. There's a rumor that's followed that family for 3 generations. That back in the 50s when Seraphina first started taking in children, nobody else wanted the Ashworths, tried to get her shut down. Went to the sheriff, said she was running something improper up on that hill. Unlicensed, unsupervised. Dangerous, even though nobody could ever say dangerous how. Why would they care? Because a woman quietly doing good work on land they used to own was a thorn they couldn't stop picking at. Pride's a strange animal, Marnie. It doesn't need a good reason. It just needs an old wound and a long memory. Rosalind's face had gone hard in a way Marnie hadn't seen on her yet. If it's the same family circling back now with a lawyer and old paperwork right when a hearing's already threatening to take that house down, I don't believe in coincidence that convenient. Which meant Marnie now had 2 separate forces pulling at the same rope. Kane wanting her gone so he could build something shiny and profitable. And somewhere behind Pruitt's careful suit, a family with a decades-old grudge against everything that house had ever stood for. And underneath both of those quieters still not fully understood the fact that somewhere in this town, a 50-something-year-old man who signed contracts and closed deals for a living had been born without ever knowing it inside the back bedroom of the very house he wanted to knock flat. She hadn't told anyone that part yet, because she hadn't fully believed it herself. Not until she went back up to the turret that same night and found the entry 2 pages past her mother's. Boy born here in the spring, mother's family from the east side. Respectable people ashamed all the same. Took her back within the week and never spoke of it again to my knowledge. I gave the child no name in this book beyond his mother's. But I heard years later secondhand that he'd grown up right here in this town without ever knowing where his first breath was drawn. Half the storefronts downtown carry his company's name on the paperwork now. Marnie read the mother's name. And then she sat very still for a long moment, doing the same kind of arithmetic she'd done at the auction. Except this time the numbers added up to something that made her stomach drop clean through the floor. Because the mother's name matched a name she'd seen exactly once before. On a folded photograph in Desmond Kane's own wallet, the one afternoon he'd pulled it out to show her a picture of the finished senior housing project, and a second older photo had slipped loose and fallen onto her porch steps before he could catch it. An elderly woman, kind eyes, younger in the photograph than she'd ever actually looked to Marnie because photographs freeze people at whatever age feels safest to remember them. He'd scooped the photo up fast, almost too fast. "My mother," he'd said, tucking it away like it embarrassed him to have dropped it at all. "She passed a few years back." Marnie hadn't thought anything of it at the time. She thought about it now. She didn't sleep well after that, because the ledger sat downstairs on the kitchen table like a live wire. Nobody had bothered to switch off, and every time she closed her eyes, she saw two different sentences layered on top of each other. Her own mother's handwriting that wasn't handwriting, the letter Serafina had kept safe for 60 years. And Kane's mother's name 3 lines above it on a page about a boy born in a back bedroom he'd probably never once set foot inside since he grew tall enough to forget it. Because if it was true, if the man trying to tear this house down had actually been born inside it, then everything about his $8,000 offer, his warm smile, his careful threats about code violations took on a completely different shape. He wasn't just a developer chasing a good deal. He was, without knowing it, trying to erase the one place that had quietly saved his own mother from whatever shame her family would have otherwise made her carry alone. Marnie sat with that fact like it was a hot coal she couldn't quite decide whether to hold or drop, because she could use it. That was the ugly, honest truth sitting right alongside everything else in her chest. She could walk into his office tomorrow and lay that page down on his desk and watch every ounce of his easy confidence drain straight out of his face. She could make him stop. Just like that. One page, one name. That's all it would take. People had used exactly that kind of leverage against her whole life. Held the one card she couldn't beat and made her fold every single time. She thought about doing the same thing back to him. She thought about it for exactly one night. And then she folded the page very carefully and tucked it into her jacket next to the deed and the county notice and decided not yet. Not like that. Not until she understood the rest of it first. Because a weapon used too early was still a weapon, and Abel had never once taught her to fight dirty, even when dirty would have been so much easier. The hearing notice on the gate had a new companion by morning. A second envelope official county letterhead informing her that the Ashworth claim had been formally filed and that it would be addressed at the same hearing on the same Tuesday in the same low-ceilinged county room with the bad carpet, which meant she now had one shot, one room, two separate people trying to take the same house out from under her for two completely different reasons, and 8 days left to figure out how a girl with $15 to her original name was supposed to stand up in front of a county board and keep any of it. She went back to the ledger that night with a different kind of urgency. Not grief anymore. Something closer to a plan trying to assemble itself out of loose parts. Because if Rosalind was right, if the Ashworths had tried to shut Serafina down decades ago, out of nothing but wounded pride, then somewhere in 60 years of careful shaking handwriting, there might be a record of exactly that. A name, a date, a confrontation. Serafina had been too proud or too frightened to ever speak about out loud, but hadn't been able to stop herself from writing down anyway. She found it 2/3 of the way through the book, tucked between two ordinary entries like Serafina had wanted it hidden in plain sight, rather than given its own separate page. "Man came today from the Ashworth family, said the sheriff would be paying me a visit soon if I didn't stop what he called my activities. Told him my activities were feeding children nobody else in this town would feed. He said that wasn't the point. Said a woman alone shouldn't have that many young ones under one roof unsupervised. Said it looked improper. I told him improper was letting a boy freeze on a porch 2 winters back rather than have his name attached to a scandal. He left angry. I expect this isn't finished. I have started keeping this book somewhere safer than my desk drawer in case anybody ever comes looking to prove I did something other than what I actually did. Marnie sat back slow because that single page did two things at once. It confirmed exactly what Rosalind had suspected, a decades-old grudge real, and documented not just old-town rumor dressed up as fact. And it explained finally why the room upstairs had ever needed sealing at all. Serafina hadn't hidden that room out of shame. She'd hidden it out of fear. Fear that somebody with old money and an older grudge might use it against her, twist 60 years of quiet love into something ugly enough to justify tearing the whole thing down. Which meant the Ashworth family's claim now, all these decades later, wasn't just about property lines. It was the same fight Serafina had been losing in slow motion her entire life, finally showing up again to finish the job. Marnie brought all of it to Rosalind the next morning, laid out across the counter like pieces of a puzzle nobody had asked for. "So it's the same family," Rosalind said quietly, reading the entry twice. "Same grudge, different generation. And it's happening at the same hearing where they're deciding whether to tear the house down anyway. That's not a coincidence, Marnie. That's a family finishing a job they started before either one of us was born. So what do I do?" Rosalind was quiet a long moment, long enough that Marnie could hear the old clock on the shop wall ticking through it, slow and unbothered, like time had absolutely no intention of hurrying up just because she needed it to. "You do what she never got the chance to do," Rosalind said finally. "You stop hiding it." That sounds a lot easier than it actually is. Everything worth doing does. Rosalind reached over and closed the ledger gently, both hands, like she was tucking a child in for the night. She kept this whole thing secret because the world she lived in would have punished her for it. Different world now, different room, different girl standing in it. She looked up. "Question is whether you're brave enough to open the door she spent 60 years keeping shut." Marnie looked down at the ledger, at the deed folded in her jacket, at the county notice curling soft at its edges from being carried around so long. 8 days. 2 claims against the only thing she'd ever owned outright in her life. One dead woman's secret sitting heavy in her hands, waiting to decide whether it was going to be a weapon or a gift. "I don't know if I'm brave," she said quietly. "I just know I'm out of other options." Rosalind almost smiled at that. Almost. "Honey," she said, "that's exactly what brave usually looks like from the inside." The county room had bad carpet and worse lighting. Marnie sat in the front row in her cleanest clothes, which weren't clean enough, with the ledger in a canvas bag on her lap. Desmond Kane came in with the building inspector and a man in a gray suit she took for a lawyer. They sat up front like the outcome was already arranged. Nathaniel Pruitt came in separately, alone, no family beside him. Just his leather folder held the same careful way he'd held it on her porch steps. The chairman called the room to order. The inspector went first, reading off a long, flat list of violations. Failing porch. Compromised roof, though patched now. No certificate of occupancy. Electrical condemned years back. He recommended demolition. The lot cleared cost to the owner or the county, whichever came first. Then Kane stood. He was good at this. Easy, warm, reasonable in the exact way that made people forget to ask hard questions. "Nobody's the villain here," he said. "A young woman bought a dangerous structure, sight unseen, for $15. She can't possibly bring it up to code alone. My company is prepared to cover demolition, settle the back taxes, and pay her a fair sum besides, so she walks away with something in her pocket instead of a debt she'll spend years climbing out of." He spread his hands to the room. "That's not cruelty. That's mercy." Heads nodded. It sounded like mercy. Pruitt stood next, shorter, colder. He laid out the Ashworth claim in flat legal language: original deed, improperly conducted tax seizure, a family's right to contest a sale that never should have happened in the first place. 2 men, 2 completely different reasons. Same result waiting at the end of both roads. The chairman looked down at her. "Miss Hale, you're the owner of record. Do you have anything to say before we vote?" Her legs did not want to hold her. They did anyway. "I do," she said. Her voice came out smaller than she wanted, so she made it bigger. "Mr. Kane says I can't bring this house up to code alone. He's right. I can't do it alone. But he doesn't know what this house actually is. None of you do. I didn't either until 11 days ago." She lifted the ledger from the bag, set it on the rail. This was sealed behind a wall nobody knew existed. 60 years of it. She opened to a page she'd marked, read it plain, no performance in her voice at all. A boy who came in half frozen and got sent to Ohio with a coat and $40. A girl who never spoke a single word for 8 months. And under her name, just this: she is safe now. The room had gone very quiet. Seraphina Doyle took in this town's throwaway children for 60 years. The ones the county couldn't place. The ones who aged out with nothing, same as I did 11 days ago. She closed the book. "You can vote to tear that down, but you should know exactly what you're tearing down first." For a moment, nobody moved. Then in the back row, an elderly woman stood leaning hard on a cane. "I lived in that house in 1968, she said, voice ringing clear across the bad carpet. "I'd be dead or worse if she hadn't taken me in. I went to nursing school. I worked at the hospital half of you were born in." She looked around the room. "I'm not a ghost story. I'm right here." A man near the door stood next, then a woman by the window. One after another, people rose and said a single year out loud, and the years ran back more than half a century, and the room filled up with the sound of a town finally saying out loud what it had only ever whispered. Kane turned in his chair, watched the place he thought he understood get to its feet all around him. Marnie turned to him. "You can buy the lot, Mr. Kane," she said quietly. "You've got the money and I don't, but you can't buy what made it matter. That part was never for sale, and it never will be." The chairman called a recess. She found him alone in the hallway, staring out a window at nothing in particular, his easy confidence gone somewhere she couldn't see anymore. She carried the folded page for 8 days now, next to the deed, next to her mother's letter. A weapon she'd decided somewhere around day 6 she was never actually going to use as one. "Mr. Kane, I don't want to hear the pitch again, Miss Hale. I understand the house means something to people. It doesn't change the math." "This isn't a pitch." She held out the page. "This was in the room too, with the boxes. I want you to have it, whether you tear the house down or not." He took it wary, the way a man takes paper he's learned not to trust. Unfolded it. Read. His eyes went down once fast, then again slow, then stopped. "Where did you get this?" he said. His voice had changed completely. "She wrote it, Seraphina. She kept track of every child who ever passed through and where most of them ended up." Marnie said it gently as she'd ever said anything in her life. "Your mother stayed here the winter before you were born, Mr. Kane. You were born in the back bedroom of this house." He didn't move, didn't speak. His whole face had come slightly undone, the way a wall comes undone once you finally know where the seam was hiding. "My mother had a year she never once talked about," he said finally. The words came slow, like each one cost him something to lift. "My whole life, something before my father. If you asked her about it, she'd leave the room. I thought—" He stopped, pressed the back of his hand hard against his mouth. "I thought it was something shameful. I spent my whole career building things, I think trying to make up for whatever it was. I never knew what it actually was." "She was 17, Marnie said. "Scared, cornered by people who wouldn't have it. And somebody took her in anyway. In the house you came here today to tear down." He looked at the page like it might dissolve if he blinked. "Why are you giving me this?" he said. "An hour ago I was trying to take your house right out from under you. Because it's true, whether I stay angry at you or not." She nodded at the page in his hands. "That's yours. It always was. I just held on to it a little while for you." For a long moment he couldn't speak at all. When he finally did, his voice came out wrecked. "My mother had a year she never named her whole life," he said. "You just handed it back to her." When the recess ended, Desmond Kane stood before the vote and withdrew his company's interest in the property entirely. Asked the county instead to grant the owner a repair timeline. Said his crews and his money were available to whoever was restoring the house on whatever terms the owner set. Said he'd cover the back taxes himself. Not to own it, only to keep it standing, which left Pruitt's claim sitting alone in the room suddenly a lot more exposed than it had been 10 minutes earlier. The chairman turned to him. "Mr. Pruitt, does your filing still stand?" Pruitt glanced once at the room full of people who just stood up one by one and put their whole histories on the record. Glanced at Kane sitting very still, the page still folded in his hand like something he intended to keep for the rest of his life. "My clients," Pruitt said carefully, "will need to review their position," which everyone in that room understood to mean exactly what it meant. A grudge finally running out of places left to hide. The inspector looking at a full room and a developer who just reversed his entire position in front of witnesses recommended a year to bring the structure to code instead of the wrecking ball. It passed. Nobody voted against a house the whole room had just stood up for. The back taxes came to a little over $4,000. 12 years of a house nobody had wanted finally settled. Kane paid it the next morning in person at the same county window where Marnie had once counted out $15 in ones and a five. He didn't ask for his name on a single piece of paper. That night he came up the hill, alone, in old clothes, not the wool coat. He stood at the broken gate a long time before he came up the walk. Marnie let him in. She didn't have power yet, but the wood stove she and Rosalind had wrestled into the front room that afternoon threw real heat for the first time in 12 years. Candles instead of lamps. And up in the turret, the window glowed gold over the whole town for anyone who cared to look up. "Can I see it?" he said. "The room." She took him up. He stopped in the doorway and looked at the walls of boxes. The small iron bed. The desk under the window where the black paint was washed clean away, now night showing through the glass instead. She found his mother's box. There wasn't much in it. A hair comb, a hospital bracelet too small to be anything but a newborn's. A slip of paper with a weight and a length and a date and spring. He sat down on the floor among 60 years of saved children, an older man in the low candlelight, and took the things out one at a time, and held them. Marnie left him there, because some rooms a person needs to sit in alone. He came down a long while later holding the small box against his chest like it might spill. "I want to help," he said. "Not buy it, not put my name on anything. Just help." He looked around the ruined front room at the wood stove, and the candles, and the cat curled by the fire. "Tell me what it's supposed to be, not what it was, what you want it to be." Marnie had been turning that question over in her head for a week without ever saying it out loud. "A place for the ones who age out with nowhere," she said. "Kids who turn 18 and get handed a garbage bag and a list of shelters. There's no place for them right now. I know because 11 days ago I was one." She looked at him. "She made this house that place for 60 years. I want to make it that again." He nodded slowly, like she'd finally handed him a blueprint he could actually read. "Then that's what we build." But it was Rosalind who made it real. She came up the hill a few days later with a folder under her arm and set it down on the kitchen table. "You can't run a house full of children out of your back pocket at 18, she said. "Not legal, not safe, not for long." She tapped the folder. "So here's what we do. We make it a real thing, a charity, a board, grown people who answer for it. I run it, but I don't carry it alone." Because that's the one mistake she made. Rosalind's voice caught on the last part. "Serafina carried this house by herself for 60 years, and this whole town let her. It near broke her in the end. We are not doing that to you." So they made it real. An elderly woman who'd spent a career in a hospital took the legal end. Kane put up the starting money and his name on none of it. Rosalind put up herself in the salvage yard and every favor she'd been quietly saving for exactly this moment. Marnie, who owned the deed in the house and the whole strange inheritance sitting inside it, signed the line as the one who would keep the door open. By spring, you wouldn't have known it for the same house. It took the whole winter in most of the town. Kane's crews put on a new roof and made the wiring honest again, but they worked alongside people who weren't on anybody's payroll at all. That was the part that actually mattered. A retired railroad man turned out to know stonework and rebuilt the porch steps by hand. A retired electrician spent his Saturdays running new circuits and refused every dollar offered for gas money. Rosalind emptied half her salvage yard up that hill. Period doors, a clawfoot tub, a farmhouse sink, all of it priced at exactly nothing. Marnie did the finish work herself. Every door and window and stair tread, Abel's plane still fitting her hand like it had grown there. The house came back under her fingers the same way that wrecked little side table had come back when she was 11 years old. Grain by grain, coat by coat. Because ruin, it turned out, was almost never as deep as it looked from the gate. Underneath it, the bones were usually still good. They just needed somebody willing to do the actual work. It wasn't all clean and easy. There was a stretch in February when the money ran thin and a cold snap froze the new pipes before they'd been wrapped. And Marnie stood in 2 inches of water in the cellar at 6 in the morning, about as close as she'd ever come to believing this whole town had been right about the house from the very start. She sat down hard on the cellar steps in the dark and let herself for about a minute feel 18 and alone and in over her head. Then she heard the front door. Boots on the stairs. Rosalind calling her name, the railroad man's voice right behind it. By noon, there were 6 people in her cellar with a shop heater and a torch, and the pipes were saved and somebody had brought soup. "This is the part the ghost stories never told," Rosalind said, pushing a bowl into her hands. "Takes a whole town to haunt a house." She almost smiled. "Takes a whole town to unhaunt one, too." The turret window got new glass, clear glass, and every single night Marnie left a lamp burning in it. People in the town below had spent years crossing the street from that dark window, calling it a ghost. Now there was a warm one burning at the top of the hill, and slowly they got used to looking up at it instead of away. For months, cars slowed at the bottom of the street to look instead of speeding past. Then somebody left a cord of split firewood at the gate with no note attached. The diner downtown started sending up the day's last pie at the end of every shift, no charge, because the owner had been one of Serafina's own kids back in the 50s and had never told a living soul either. She had bought a haunted house for $15. What she'd actually bought, it turned out, was a town's one chance to finally make something right. And once they understood that, they took it with both hands. They came on a Sunday in May, the ones who could. Rosalind had spent 2 months tracking them down, working from names in the ledger, and a list Marnie had started on the back of an old envelope, calling numbers and writing letters and following threads across 40 years in a dozen states. Not all of them were still living. Some couldn't travel, but more than 30 of them came back to the house on the hill that Sunday. Gray-haired, most of them, some with their own grown children in tow, and they walked through the rooms where they'd once been children and put their hands flat against the door frame in the back hall, the one scarred top to bottom with pencil marks, and found the lines that belonged to them. Marnie watched a man in his 60s show his daughter a mark 4 feet off the floor, with his own name beside it, dated 1968, and watched the daughter understand all at once exactly where her father had come from. She had taken the boxes down from the sealed room and laid them out across the long kitchen table, every single one, and she gave them back. People found their own, held them, cried, held strangers, and cried over those too. Kane stood off to the side for a long while with his mother's small box. Then he did something Marnie hadn't expected. He cleared his throat in that crowded room and told them all plainly who his mother had been and where he had taken his first breath, and that he'd spent 50 years ashamed of a thing that had actually been the kindest year of a frightened girl's entire life. He said it so nobody else in that room would ever have to feel ashamed of the same kind of thing again. Two women who'd been at the house the same winter in the 70s found each other across the crowded kitchen, having lost track of one another for 50 years and held on a long, long time. A man read his own entry out loud to his grandchildren, right up to the line where Serafina had written came an angry left kind, and couldn't quite finish reading it out loud. They ate in that big kitchen built to feed a crowd, and for the first time in 12 years it fed one. Marnie stood in the doorway at one point and looked at that long table full of people who had every one of them once been a child nobody wanted, who had grown up and grown old and climbed a hill they'd spent their whole lives afraid of, just to come back to the one house that had loved them when nothing else would. She thought Serafina should have lived to see it. Then she thought maybe in the only way that actually counted she finally had. Nobody renamed the house. Somebody suggested a plaque once and Marnie said no. It was the Doyle house. It had always been the Doyle house. And it would stay the Doyle house because the woman it was named for had never once wanted a single word of credit while she was alive, and she wasn't going to get a brass sign now that she was gone. The only thing that changed was the window. It stayed lit. The first new arrival came in October, almost a year to the day since Marnie had first climbed that hill herself. Rosalind brought her up in the truck. She was 16, all sharp shoulders and watchful eyes. One garbage bag of clothes on her lap and a chip on her shoulder you could have split kindling with. She'd aged out of nothing official, just run from a house that wasn't safe, and slept behind the laundromat for a week before somebody finally told Rosalind, and Rosalind told her there was a place up the hill where the door stayed open. She stood at the broken gate, which Marnie had left broken on purpose, because every single one of them stood at that gate first. This the haunted house, she said. It wasn't quite a question. That's what they used to call it. Marnie came down the walk toward her. Name's Marnie. What do I call you? Marnie's fine. She stopped in front of the girl. It's not fancy. You make your own bed. You do your own dishes. There's school in the morning whether you like it or not. Cat's named Ash. He's mean to mice, decent to anybody who feeds him. She let one shoulder rise easy. You stay, you eat. That's the whole deal. It's the only one I've ever really known how to offer. What's the angle? The girl said. Nobody gives a bed away for nothing. Somebody gave me one. A woman who used to live here. I never met her. She was gone 12 years before I ever turned up, and she still found a way to leave the door open for me. Marnie tilted her head slightly toward the porch light, warm and gold behind her. So now I keep it open. That's the whole angle. The girl looked at her like she was waiting for the catch, because there is always a catch when you've already lived a life that puts a 16-year-old behind a laundromat. Marnie knew that look from the inside, so she didn't push. She just stepped back, held the gate open, and after a long moment the girl picked up her garbage bag and came through it. Come on, Marnie said quiet. Let's get you inside before it gets cold. Somebody's warming up dinner. There always is now. The girl didn't answer, but she followed her up the walk past the porch Abel would have been proud of, past the door frame, waiting for one more pencil line, and into a kitchen that had been built almost 100 years ago to feed exactly this many people. And somewhere upstairs in a turret with clear glass and a lamp already lit against the coming dark, a house that had once been called haunted kept doing the only thing it had ever really known how to do. It kept the door open.